Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I would like to talk about this camera right here. It's the Canon EOS 30D. Now this camera has been out for quite a while now, I know, and it's also not that long ago since I last talked about the Canon EOS 20D, but in this video I just feel like sharing about this camera simply because it's another fun camera to use and I personally really enjoy using this camera as well. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon EOS 30D, now this camera came out quite a long time ago, as I mentioned earlier, I believe at around 2006, but this camera is still quite capable if you're not really requiring a lot from the camera, and whether if you're shooting portraits or landscapes or just like basic travel photography or what have you in a very similar genre, I think that this camera is still very reliable and capable. And in this video I'll be covering the usability, the ergonomic side of things, and then I'll be also covering the image quality and pretty much leading into my conclusion. And before I start with the ergonomics and the operational side of things, I would like to just spend a bit of time comparing between these two cameras, like just generally talking, because some of you might be considering the 20D, sorry, and you know, just with a different in price, because the 20D is indeed a cheaper option and the 30D does have some upgrades, but for some people the upgrades might not matter that much because the image quality, even for today's standards, are actually quite similar. So let me first just cover a few differences. So the 30D has a much bigger screen at 2.5, the 20D has 1.8 inch screen, and to be honest, they both are very viewable in sunlight and they're not that much of a difference. But if you have to be a pixel peep, the 30D is definitely a more detailed and a tiny bit brighter screen. Of course, the bigger real estate is also going to give you an advantage on just zooming in and viewing that detail of the image. But talking about the image, the resolution on the 20D is an 8.25 megapixel versus an 8.2 megapixel on the 30D, but the 30D can shoot at, well, the same frame rates as this 20D, which is 5 frames per second, but the Canon EOS 30D has a bigger buffer, shooting at around 11 raw files or 30 JPEGs in one buffer before it has to slow down and start writing. Finish writing. The 20D has about 6, I believe, raw images per buffer, or 23 JPEGs per buffer. So if you're shooting a very long burst, which to be honest these two cameras can do, you can just shoot a tiny bit longer with the 30D if that matters more to you. But these are just generally the differences. You know, the battery life are practically very similar or the same, because it's only a very small increment upgrade on the battery power capacity, but it's very small that you don't really notice. And to be honest, I can just use the battery in the 20D on my 30D and from the 30D into my 20D, which I really swap between the two quite often without knowing. So yeah, that's it for, you know, the main differences and similarities. But now let's dive into the usability, the operational side, and the ergonomics of this camera first. I really love the ergonomics and the feeling of this camera. I think that the grip is really nice and I really enjoy using this camera because of how tough it feels, how solid it feels, but also how comfortable it feels, even after, you know, a whole day of shooting with it, because I love to generally take old cameras out to do street photography, do some simple photography out there. It's very refreshing to the mind. It's just keeping it very core essential to photography, and you know, just less distraction and just more focus on the exposure triangle, like what is important in photography, the storytelling and everything. And this camera actually makes me want to focus on those things, and I think that's really important in a camera. This camera is also weather sealed, but yeah, the viewfinder is actually quite nice, big and bright. It is almost 100% coverage, which is great, and the AF inside is also really quick. I'm focusing between the camera and my wall at the back, which is like 5 meters away from the camera. No, actually 6 meters. So yeah, it's actually a really fast autofocusing system, as long as you're also aware of its age and limitations. Again, there are only 9 AF points in here, so you can't really expand a lot, but those 9 AF points actually cover all the rule of third point, so it's actually quite nice. So in some cases, actually rare cases, you might have to focus and recompose, but for most cases I find if you're just focusing on portraits or street photography or landscapes or just kind of general photography kind of thing, I think that this camera will definitely cover it, at least with the AF points. Yeah, and this camera can also go up to 8,000th of a second, which is what I really love, because I love putting bright lenses on here, because some cameras can actually only go up to 4,000th of a second in this class, but with this camera it goes all the way to 8,000th of a second, which is actually quite nice. The ports and button layout on this camera is actually quite nice. So the button layouts are actually quite nice at your fingertips. They actually logically arrange, and because this camera is still a photography core essential camera, that means that a lot of buttons up here, it doesn't take long to really memorize, but also it's all the core essential buttons as well, so you don't need to dive into the menu system. But talking about the menu system, this camera actually has a very nice organized menu system. It's actually pretty much the same as the 20D and the 10D, but yeah, it's just one long page that is color-coded in a very organized way. There are not a lot of sub-menus, which is good, and yeah, just keeping things very simple. The screen is actually viewable in sunlight, as I mentioned earlier, and with this bigger screen at 2.5 inch, it's definitely usable, and yeah, you still can judge your colors really accurately. The only thing is I wish that it would have a tiny bit more contrast just to judge the blacks a little bit, but you know, you still can zoom in and see the detail that you want to see and everything. And I guess at the end of the day, especially for this price range, that's really all that matters. So yeah, and the ports, as I was talking earlier, it's actually quite nicely divided here, and you know, you don't have to open the whole ports. That if you need to use only the USB cable to transfer images, then you can just open this flap and just plug in your USB cable. And talking about USB cable, you still can actually shoot tether with this camera. So not only that, you can use something like the EOS utility to just, you know, tether shooting with this camera, you can actually use even apps like Lightroom to tether shoot. So let's say if you're just shooting studio or shooting portraits and you just want the images right away on the computer, you can just connect the application software through the USB cable and onto this camera, and then yeah, just shoot, and then it'll just load onto your computer or your whatever software you have it tether with. So yeah, I think that's actually still quite useful, especially if you also want to remote shoot from somewhere, because not only that you have to press the shutter button, you can actually press the virtual shutter button, especially in Canon EOS utility app or software, assuming your operating system still supports it, and you can just set this camera like 5 or 10 or even 20 meters, assuming you have long enough cable for it. Now onto the next point, this camera is actually weather sealed, just like the 20D, and of course if you have a weather sealed lens mounted on this camera, it will be fully weather sealed, which means that if you want to take this camera onto like some sort of harsh weather condition, let's say into the rain or into the snowstorm or into some sort of heat wave or even into the desert, you can actually take this camera and it'll just be fine and handle quite well. And the battery life will also handle quite well as well, simply because this camera doesn't require a lot of electricity, because all it really does is, you know, when you press focus, it really just try to focus, or if you're just reviewing the image quality, well, that's when the screen is turned on, or if you're just taking pictures, it just activates the shutter curtain and, you know, shoot with the sensor and mirror flipping up and down, things like that. So it really doesn't require a lot from the battery. So in my case, the battery already lasts for quite a few days and it's still showing full bars, so that's quite nice. The memory card that it takes is the CF cards, but because of how old this camera is, you can actually buy really cheap compact flash cards and actually put it in here. And yeah, it will actually just works reliably. Some people just prefer using an SD card and put it into the compact flash card adapter and just put it in the camera because they like SD cards more. I personally prefer CF cards because I feel like, well, in my opinion, they're actually cropped less and also more reliable and much faster. But yeah, that's just based on user experience and user preference. And the next point is the mode dial. So a lot of semi-professional cameras don't really give you full automatic or semi-automatic modes. This camera actually provides you with all of these full manual, automatic, semi-automatic modes and everything. So I guess that's quite good, especially if you just want to dip your toe into photography and just pretty much learn the essentials and see if you really like the camera or not, or like photography or not. So you can just really experiment with different modes and then just grow as you go on with photography. And my last point before I start talking about the image quality is actually the flash. The flash is actually quite nicely implemented on here. It's quite reliable and also bright enough, but because of how high this is, it's actually quite nice, because if you're photographing portraits, especially at night, having such a high pop-up flash like this away from the lens also means that you will have a lesser chance of actually encounter red eye. Of course, it's not going to completely eliminate red eye, but you know, should you be using the flash in low light to photograph portraits, there's a high chance that the red eye will actually be reduced, and you don't really need to spend that much time in post processing the images or retouching the images. So yeah. And now to the image quality. Well, in my experience, the image quality on this camera actually is quite nice and unique. It has a very matte look to the images, and I just quite like that. Of course, it makes sense because, you know, cameras at that time are trying to compete with film as well, even though a lot of people were already using and converting to digital. But for professional line of cameras and semi-professional line of cameras, it's really using film as a standard, because it really tries to win over professional from, you know, converting from film or analog into digital. So yeah, that's why a lot of cameras from that time period tends to look a bit matte, but also quite unique in its own way. And if you really want to experiment into this color science, into this kind of color tones, I would really highly recommend as well, simply because yeah, it's a very unique look that you don't really get in the more modern day standards sensors. Also, the color rendition between different complex tone with this camera, and also how it renders between highlights and shadows, just like the 20D, it actually handles it quite nicely and also naturally, which is something to appreciate, especially for a camera of this age. And you will still see a lot of details within the image quality as well, so that's quite nice. Now, of course, talking about the shadows and highlights, this camera doesn't have a lot of dynamic range to play with, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter because of how natural the rendition between the tones and the highlights and the shadows is. I feel like, yeah, it's already very natural, and it really does produce its own unique look on its own. So dynamic range doesn't really matter that much. And so yeah, if you're really looking to the camera that can actually take really detailed pictures in both highlights and shadows at the same time, maybe look into a more newer camera. Whereas with this camera, you can't really achieve that unless if you take bracketing images. Then you can achieve that, of course, and it will still look quite natural. But in the same time, I would say that this camera, for general purposes in photography, it still deals quite nicely. And the sensor will also deals really nicely with the skin tones, whether if it's complex skin tone or just simple skin tone, it will just deal with the rendition, the gradient, the actual detail of the tones within those skin tones really nicely as well. I know I'm just really selling a lot on this camera, but in the same time, I really love the image quality of this camera quite a bit. Apart from the dynamic range, I really cannot complain a lot about this camera, and it's just something to really appreciate that the camera in this age can already, you know, render such good images already out of the camera. That said, this camera does not have sensor cleaning, so despite not really affecting the image quality, but if you change your lenses quite often, you might find some dust spots that you have to correct later in post, so just keep that in mind. I think that it's only after the Canon EOS 400D line of cameras and also after the Canon 40D line of cameras is when Canon actually introduced the sensor cleaning technology. So yeah, with the cameras like the 30D and earlier, you have to still clean your sensor manually. But of course, if you don't change your lenses that often, chances that your sensors are still clean and dust-free is actually quite high. So yeah, you don't really have to worry about it. And yeah, otherwise try not to use high ISO, at least not higher than 800 when you're shooting with this camera. Otherwise, it will show some noise, especially if you try to recover a lot of shadows. It will show a lot of noise if you use higher ISO than 800 in my experience. But of course, if you're only shooting into, you know, putting down into social media, things like that, then feel free to just use maybe 1250 and maybe in post just do a little bit of denoising, because 8 megapixel is actually still a lot of resolution. So let's say a lot of people are really crazy about, 4K, if the camera shoots 4K or not. This camera doesn't shoot 4K, but 4K is essentially roughly approximately 8 megapixels, or if you think that's high, then 8 megapixels is also actually quite high. That means you can actually do 4K time-lapse with this camera, should you wish to do so, and then export it in 4K later in post. And yeah, that's it about the image quality, and now into the conclusion. And yeah, overall, I really love using this camera. It's a very responsive camera, of course, assuming you know its limitations. But yeah, the autofocusing system is really good, really snappy and really quick. Let me actually show you the shutter sound. Yeah, the focusing system is really quick and snappy and also very accurate. The shutter is really nice, and I just love the shutter sound on its own. And yeah, if 8 megapixels is enough for you, I would really highly recommend this camera, to be honest with you, because even with 8 megapixels, the details are still there. It's really nicely preserved, and the color reproduction is just great. You have all the main core essential features with you here, with the button layouts and everything. It sounds like I'm advertising this camera, but really I'm not. I'm really just surprised with, the performance of this camera and how well it's really lasts throughout the year. And especially with the price point you can get this camera nowadays, for a weather sealed camera, a camera that you can actually experiment with different lenses, both EF and EFS lenses on here, which is great. It's really a camera that you can really grow into. Of course, something like white balance might not be accurate from time to time if you compare it to your, let's say, iPhones or something like that. But it's something that you can just learn and adjust to, and for the most part, it will actually get its job done anyway. So yeah. I think that 5 frames per second is still pretty much good enough for general purpose photography, and the shutter is also quite harsh, but also light enough that it doesn't really disturb the images that much, because in some of the cameras, some of the mirrors actually flips up and down really harsh, that it causes a little bit blurry images if you don't use high enough shutter speed. But that's really a matter of usage or experience per photographer. So yeah, in my opinion and in my experience, this camera has a very nice shutter. I'll leave it there. And yeah, if you don't really need a lot of features, let's say Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, or what have you, and just want to just photograph and document and just enjoy using, whether if you're just traveling or doing portraits or just doing some experiments, then yeah, this camera is the way to go. And also, if you don't like the camera at the end of the day, you can pretty much sell it at the same price or even higher. So yeah, there's not really much to complain about here. But of course, just keep in mind, this camera doesn't have live view features, so you cannot use your screen here to really compose your images. So it could be a downside for some people, but for a lot of people, it can just be something like, yeah, they're used to it, or yeah, they can just grow into using the optical viewfinder, which is also great. And having an optical viewfinder is actually a good thing if you really want to learn into photography, because after a while, you'll just learn to get used to the optical viewfinder, and then you'll just learn to, predict which settings to use under which circumstances to get the image that you really want. So yeah, that's pretty much how I learned photography and learned to pretty much guesstimate all the settings as well. So yeah, if you want to learn that way, it's also a nice way to learn, and then therefore you can actually use any cameras that you want. Otherwise, I don't really have any complaints about this camera. It's not really that good in low light, but you kind of expect that out of a camera that's this old. That said, it still has big sensors, so you still can do a lot of experimentations with it, let's say using shallow depth of field or using brighter lenses to shoot in low light. And to be honest, a lot of the cheaper but brighter EF and EFS lenses are actually getting cheaper and cheaper nowadays, especially on the secondhand market, as industries are moving to the mirrorless cameras. And yeah, you can really explore and also experiment a lot with those lenses, and also third-party lenses as well. And because it's only 8 megapixels, it's not going to demand a lot out of the lenses as well. So that's also another bright side. And yeah, I don't really have other major points to really talk about. If you need a free photography guidebook, absolutely for beginner and absolutely for free, it's on my website. The link is down in the description section below. If you have any questions, feel free to also leave them down in the comment section below as well. I will definitely do my best to reply to all of them. And yeah, I would like to just leave it here. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.